Hi all out there. It's been a while since I've done a serious video, especially about the scandemic. We're going back a few years now, but it still hurts a lot of people, a lot of families. Be interesting to hear from some of the people that contacted me in one of my original videos about not being forced to be jabbed, and it was your right to seek an exemption from your medical professional until you at least had proper investigation into the side effects and net benefits of the medical product. And it wasn't too long after that video, I think it was 7 days, that Otago sent all the GPs in Australia a letter saying that there was no grounds for an exemption other than if you were already harmed from an initial injection. That video went viral. I'd like to hear from some people. The reason for the video today is obviously for those people in Victoria and in Australia. We've recently learned from a Freedom of Information request that the lockdowns in Victoria and the curfews were not lawful. That is, in the state of in the medical emergency, only directions can come from the chief health officer or the chief medical officer. But the curfews and lockdowns were generated solely from Daniel Andrews through his cabinet. And this poses a lot of questions in relation to the law. So firstly, Daniel Andrews acted outside the law, because in the Health and Wellbeing Act 2008, it states that all decisions made in relation to health and wellbeing, including quarantine, have to be judged against the Human Rights Act, Human Rights and Dignity Act. And this obviously wasn't. So he's in breach of his own act, that act he created in 2008 when he was Health Minister. Now, there are going to be a lot of people out there that will say, oh, well, there was a pandemic and, they just did what they did. But they had enough means at their disposal to be able to deal with a pandemic, so-called, without locking people down and imposing curfews. Now, the effect that curfews and lockdowns had on this state were enormous, to the fact that our kids, our grandkids and our great-grandkids are going to be paying off this debt for up to 75 years, if we ever pay it off. Not to mention the businesses that were lost, the lives that were lost because businesses had failed, people lost their homes, families were broken. And the reason why I'm making this video is this irks me so much that a lot of us in the beginning were really worried about where the government was going with this, who was controlling them, and where they were going to go with it. And forced injections was one thing, but curfews and lockdowns was another. That affected everyone in the state, whether you agreed with the so-called virus or not. That affected everyone. To a point where now, in Victoria, at least, we have this thing. I shall get it out. So this thing here is a land tax statement, $975. Not a lot for me, right? I own a block of land which I purchased before the pandemic because I knew that the writing was on the wall, something was happening, and I wanted to have a place to escape. How right was I? So I have this document which is demanding $975 from me. And the reason for it is that's to, hang on, train's coming. The reason for that $975 in relation to my property is to pay back the COVID debt that the state incurred because of the decisions that it made in relation to the so-called pandemic. Now, this tax has come about by the unlawful decision to have curfews and lockdowns which closed businesses. Another train. Which closed businesses, put people out of work, put people out of their homes, reduced revenue for the state, stopped people visiting because we were a basket case. That debt was a direct correlation with the decisions made by Daniel Andrews and his cabinet, which were unlawful. Not to mention, signed off by the Commissioner of State Revenue, Paul Broderick. Now, Paul Broderick has been in the public service, especially as the Commissioner of State Revenue, for 21 years. Now, you think he would know better than sending these documents out. So the first thing I'm going to say in this video is, if anyone has got a tax debt notice, a land tax debt notice in relation to the COVID debt, now that we know, I mean we already knew, but now that we officially know that none of these decisions were made under medical advice, they were done outside of the law in relation to a state emergency, I suggest you do what I'm going to do and send this document back, this bill back, to the Commissioner of State Revenue and ask him to pass it on to Daniel Andrews, because he's the one that's ultimately responsible for that debt. He was warned by millions of Australians. The state governor was warned by millions of Australians. Now, in the end, the governor, who's supposed to act on advice from their ministers to make sure that a law is binding to the Crown, failed in her obligations. So there's the second thing that we see. We've seen that the ministers didn't provide details to the governor, or the governor just ignored them. In any case, the governor has failed in her duties and her oath to act on behalf of the people, which is us, to protect us. And once Pippa has a little roll in the grass. Good girl, Pippa. Good girl. Yeah. Good girl. Now we'll get on to the voting. Obviously we have a federal election coming up. Now, in the last state election, the Victorian state election, after all the lockdowns, after all the nonsense that we had to go through as people in this dictatorial state, we still voted the Labor Party in. Now, fair enough, it was only 32.8% of first preferences that the Andrews government got, but it was the preferences that got them over the line. But what you've seen in the last state election, the last state Queensland election, even when Plibersek got in, and previous federal elections, we've seen a slow deterioration of the two-party vote, because people are starting to wake up to what the two parties actually represent, and that's not you, the people. People are starting to wake up to the fact that we actually have a constitution, and since 1960, and especially since 1973, that constitution has been eroded and dissolved because people have let it because they don't know about it. Now, since 1973, we've had an enormous amount of immigrants, which is great, because immigrants into a country means that it's a place that people want to come. It brings new productivity, new skills, new ideas. But the problem is, new immigrants don't know that we have a constitution, and that constitution was the framework for us to keep the government in check. And the government haven't been kept in check. The government have done whatever the hell they've wanted, whether it's Liberal, Labor, whoever gets voted in. An example of this is, if any of you understand how a bill is presented into Parliament, either state or federally, a bill is presented by a person and is warranted by a second person or a third person. All the bills since 1973, bar 2 or 3, have been presented are all from the United Nations, the World Economic Forum, or the Bank of International Returns. Just the 3 bodies that are controlling Australia, not us. Since then, we have lost our national wealth, we have lost our manufacturing base, we have lost our intellectual base, because most of our universities are filled with international students who will take a degree back home with them. And although I don't disagree with that, I'm all for people getting an education wherever they want to. But if there's only a certain amount of places in a university to get educated, and someone that's born and raised here misses out on that education, then that's an issue. And that's been happening more and more since 1973, to the point where the tertiary bodies have become corporate institutions that sell their degrees to the people who pay the most. What that also does is it drives up HEX fees for those people who do have the ability to get an ACTA score to get to their preferred course. They will have to pay higher HEX fees purely and simply because of supply and demand. Now, who's tied to these 3 bodies? Well, we know. Labor, Liberal, Greens and Nationals. They're all tied to these bodies. They're tied to the BIR system and the Reserve Bank system. And while we are tied to this system, we are going to get conned just like we did in the state of Victoria with Daniel Andrews and his crony cabinet and the fake governor, and in Australia with the fake Governor General and the fake Parliament of Australia, which is not even legitimate. This election is a big opportunity to keep the trend going in not voting for the Quadra Party and voting for someone who's going to represent you as a constituent in your local area. How many people vote out there because their dad and granddad voted Labor or their dad and granddad voted Liberal? I run a business, so Liberal are going to look after me. I'm a worker, so Labor are going to look after me. Surely by now you know that's a whole lot of bullshit. Surely by now you understand this is a whole lot of bullshit. Post-pandemic, people need to wake up and understand that there's greater things out there to achieve than the maintenance of a system that eventually will fall. How is it that Australia, the most mineral resource country in the world, natural gas, oil, iron ore, aluminium, zinc, copper, how is it that a country like this has people homeless and in poverty? There's countries out there such as, There's countries out there that only have a dual natural resource system, such as oil and gas, and they're selling to the market 1,000 times greater than what we sell to the market, and their residents, the residents of those countries don't pay income tax, don't pay medical, don't pay stamp duty on purchase of properties. They are just free to do as they choose, to run a business, to work as a carpenter, to be a nurse, to sweep the streets. They are free to do that because there's no encumbrance on them. How is it that a country like ours has 40% tax rate, has got land tax because of government ineptitude, has poverty, has youth violence, has homeless, has a less than 1% vacancy rate on rentals, and then we're still bringing in another 1 million immigrants this year? Again, like I said, I don't care about who comes to the country, but what we need to do is make sure it's sustainable. So, for example, if there is a pocket in a society that has a less than 1% vacancy rate, that means that you have less than 1 in 100 chance of even applying for a property, let alone being accepted to a property. Now, let's say that, I'm not pointing out any particular race here, but let's say that pocket is Cranbourne East in Victoria, where there is a high percentage of Indians who own property and who own rental properties. If you're a non-Indian that applies for that rental property, even though you tick all the boxes, the likelihood of you getting that property is non-existent because the landowners, the investment owners who are Indians, will not pick you, nor will the agents who are Indian. Now, this may sound racist, but this is just a fact. This is what happens. Same in Springvale with Vietnamese, same in St Albans with Maltese. Right? The problem is when you have that particular vacancy rate and you have a completely unaffordable new home buyer market, there's only two things that can happen. One, the market will crash, that is the housing market, which is zero chance of happening because the government's always prop it up. Or there will be an enormous amount of homeless people, which, if you have a look at the park that I'm walking through now, when I walked through here 2 weeks ago, there was 13 tents in this park, mostly new immigrants. There was one Australian guy who's been homeless for 7 years, but mostly new immigrants that, just speaking to them, are all males. They either had a falling out with their partner, or there was some issue socially in their environment, and they were forced to be homeless. And this particular park had a market recently, so obviously the police and council had come and kicked out all the homeless people to move their tents, some of which have moved under the bridge that we just passed about 8 minutes ago, and others have moved to other parts of Sunshine, including the baseball fields and the back of the council offices at Parsons Reserve. So let's go back to who you're going to vote for. A lot of media say anyone that's not Labour, Lib, Nuts, Green is a right-wing Nazi fascist. What I want you to do is I want you to ring your local independent members before you vote. Ask them some questions about what they propose to do for your community, what they propose to do for you. What do they propose to do when they get into Parliament? Are they happy with legislation that's being passed, presented, or are they unhappy with legislation that's being passed and presented? And then try and do this. Try and ring your Labor or Liberal member and see if you can get an answer to any of those questions. Because I guarantee you, unless you're in a regional area, you won't get no answer. So just circling back to original point, if you've got a state revenue tax bill, land tax bill, return it back to the Commissioner. Now that we know Daniel Andrews acted outside the law, it's Daniel Andrews' responsibility, that tax bill. There was more than 1 million people who wrote to the government, to the local members, and to the governor between 2020 and 2023 to let them know that what the government were doing was going to have long-term consequences for the state and for the country. And we were proven right once again. Anyway, I'd like to hear from you in the comments. It's been 3.5 years since I've done a serious video like this, but there's going to be a few more because we're going to be in for some dark times if Labor get back in, or Liberal get back in, or the Parliament's return with a Greens majority. A Green minority. Yeah, tough times.